Litbite Lite, obrolan virtual yang ringan dan bergizi. Mari saling sapa, berbagi cerita, bertukar gagasan, dan mendiskusikan isu-isu terbaru dan industri kreatif lainnya.
Hello, I am Yani Kurniawan from 17.000 Pulau Imaji Foundation. Thank you for joining our event Litbite Lite, a monthly program from the foundation. This April, we will raise issues around daily literacy and the environment related to the commemoration of the Earth Day and the International Book Day. We will broadcast several programs related to this issue so that we can raise our awareness about the importance of the literacy and the sustainability of the planet that we live on for the next generation. For your information, some of these events have aired at the Jakarta Content Week 2020. We hope that the session you are about to watch can broaden your view and sharpen your mind. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Good evening for those of you who are in Asia Pacific area, and welcome to the grand finale session of the Jakarta Content Week. Jakarta Content Week is an event that is being held under the partnership between Yayasan 17.000 Pulau Imaji and Frankfurter Buchmesse. In this very session, we are going to talk about a special topic, actually one that is really close to my heart. And we are also virtually flying in a very special guest from New York. I think the topic that we will be talking about today can be summarized in one word, for me at least, which is doomsday. And I think as the author who will be talking to us today have covered in one of the chapters in his book, humanity have been telling the story of doomsday in different ways and for such a long time. And I think today, especially in this, century of overwhelming information and content, there's one, doomsday that's a bit scenario of doomsday that is a bit different from any other one, because first of all, it's a doomsday scenario that is backed by scientific evidence. But also, secondly, it's the kind of doomsday that where our action can actually make a difference. How we are dealing with what we do today might change the course of how bad the doomsday will look like for us in the future. And again, in this very in the century of post-truth and flood of information, I think the power of storytelling is really key, is really important. And one of the key people when we think about who are the storytellers of the climate crisis, the doomsday of the century that we should be talking about, is David Wallace-Wells, the author of The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, who is also the deputy editor of New York Magazine. I want to say hi first to David, who's already with us tonight. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, Afu. It's great to be talking to you and great to be virtually in Jakarta for this event. I'm very happy to be participating.
Yeah, hopefully, sometime in the future you get to visit Jakarta before the flood from the climate crisis, is sinking the city. But we should be talking about the gore or dark part later. For now, I think perhaps you can tell us a little bit for those among us who haven't. I'm sure very few among the audience today who haven't actually read your book. Maybe you can give a very brief summary of what it talks about.
Absolutely. It's a survey of the state of scientific knowledge about the future as climate change will transform it. And unfortunately, that scientific knowledge is quite bleak. The crisis is happening faster than most people understand. In fact, happening faster than most scientists predicted, and is, as people in Indonesia know well, in many parts of the world already here in quite dramatic ways. It's also much more all-encompassing than I think most casual observers really understand or understood until quite recently, that it's not just a matter of melting Arctic ice and the fate of polar bears, but it has to do with agricultural yields and forest fires and economic productivity and mental health and violence between states and violence between individuals. There's sort of no aspect of human life that is unaffected by the forces of climate change. And my book is a sort of an effort to showcase the full scope of those transformations. And then, of course, to also paint a somewhat more dire picture than I think most people really appreciated about the climate crisis until quite recently, which is to say, you know, things could get really quite bad quite soon. We are today at about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming beyond the pre-industrial average. And that doesn't sound like very much, but it means that the planet is already entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose the entire history of human civilization, which means everything that we've ever known as a civilization or civilizations were built on climate conditions that we've already left behind. And we're likely to see, almost certain to see, about twice as much warming as we have today, which means that to the extent that we're beginning to see in tropical cyclones and wildfires and heat waves the effects of unprecedented climate, we're going to be living in a world that is at least twice as much transformed in relatively short order, which means that for people of your age and my age, the world as we know it in middle age will look very, very different than the world as we knew it as children, and certainly dramatically different than, say, our grandparents saw it when they were alive. And I think that the book tries to explain and explore and showcase those changes, but also begin the project of thinking about what it will be like to be living on that planet, not to treat it as, you know, the end beyond which we can't see, but to take seriously the prospect that even in a degraded world assaulted by the impacts of climate change, there will be billions of people on the planet, many of whom are living lives they recognize as flourishing and fulfilling. And how do we square those two facts? How can the world be as transformed as we know it will be, while still generating human life that is recognizable and human society that seems familiar? I think we're only beginning to sort of think through those questions, but my book is an effort to jumpstart that conversation.
Yeah, and I think your book did a really good job at that. I actually have it right here with me in my study. I got my hands on this book around a year ago, and I think what it really has successfully done is, you know, just as you said, it painted a more fairer, more, you know, paint the dire picture of what climate crisis looks like. And the timing for that is really critical, and the time is now. And you know, before your book, people usually ask me, you know, if they want to learn more about the climate crisis, what kind of primer book can they read? And before your book, it's always a bit hard for me to you know, point on one specific book. But now this book has always been my answer, because it covers the whole picture, as you said, from, you know, the agriculture, the food crisis, down to the conflict, how it will hit the economy, and so on. And there's one line in your book that I still very much remember. The first line, actually, if I remember correctly, it is much, much worse than you think. And it really hits hard on me. Actually, I'm probably among the people who already know that it's gonna be bad. And the book really pushed the urgency, the fear factor in me. So I think as a storyteller, that's where I want to discuss more with you. You know, storytellers have a toolbox of things that they can borrow on in telling the story, right? And I think in this book, that factor of fear, the fear factor, is really what you utilize. How have you found that effective? Has that always been the goal? Like, you know, I want people to be more fearful of this crisis, or are there other things in the toolbox that you also leverage? I don't know if, you know, as Indonesians, for example, we really like analogies. And usually I say, when people say, oh, what difference does 1 degree Celsius make? I say, you know, the difference is between when your body temperature goes from 37 degrees Celsius. I know you guys don't use Celsius. I don't know what the equivalent in Fahrenheit is, but, you know, just a degree of change can mean life or death for humans. So, you know, do you use, what kind of toolbox toolbox of storytelling do you use in the book?
Well, honestly, I came to this subject not thinking about it as strategically as that. I wasn't writing about climate change as an advocate, but as a journalist. And I thought my main obligation was simply to tell the truth and to be honest and transparent in showcasing the state of the science as I understood it. Now, to me, that science was really scary. And my awakening from someone who was aware of climate change, but not deeply engaged in it as recently as a few years ago, to someone who was really preoccupied by it and sort of couldn't see anything going on in the world and not think about climate change. That awakening for me had to do with fear. I'm somebody who's always been interested in the near future, science and technology, and I was sort of more and more seeing a few years ago reports about the state of climate science that struck me as quite alarming. And it wasn't just that they were scary, it was that they, as I was sort of saying a few minutes ago, they added up to a total picture. So it wasn't just that climate change seemed bad, it was that it seemed enormous, that this was now the theater in which all of human life would be conducted this century. And so you couldn't think about, say, geopolitical challenges or developmental challenges, or even cultural stories and trajectories without sort of integrating the threat of climate change. And my personal response to that was to be scared, but also sort of awed that this was such a dramatic narrative that we were all living through, and in fact had created ourselves, because the lion's share of the climate crisis has been engineered in just the last few decades. So I'm 38 years old now, which means my life sort of contains most of the damage that's been done to the planet because of the production of carbon emissions. And assuming I live another 30 or 40 years, it will also contain the bulk of our response. And that fact that I'll be alive to see both of those unbelievably dramatic stories unfold was an incredibly stirring, exhilarating, yes, terrifying, but also just awe-inspiring revelation that I had. Now, I don't think that everybody out there is going to be motivated or triggered by the same emotions that I had, and I wouldn't suggest that everybody writing about the climate crisis or making movies about the climate crisis, or making animations or whatever, writing music, that everybody focus exclusively on fear, in part because I don't only feel fear. I'm sometimes optimistic. I'm sometimes have a kind of poetic appreciation for the fact of the planet being transformed so dramatically. There's sort of existential threads through my thinking. Fear isn't the only emotion, but it felt to me the deepest and most primal one when I was waking up to the crisis. And so as I was writing my book, I did think about how I might produce or reproduce the experience that I had in readers. And I think as a writer, that's not the only thing that you can try to do to try to give people the sense of the world as you see it, but it's maybe the most straightforward way of communicating your own sense of a story. And I think we've been lucky in certain ways and unlucky in other ways that telling the truth and being honest about the state of the climate and encouraging people to open their eyes about what's happening already today and what is likely to happen over the next decade has actually produced a kind of a global awakening. When I finished writing my book in September of 2018, we had not heard of Greta Thunberg. There were no climate strikes. Extinction Rebellion hadn't been formed in the UK. In the US, we didn't have Sunrise. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hadn't been elected to Congress. That wasn't that long ago. That was 2 years ago. And there was nothing beyond the Paris Accords, which maybe we'll talk about, approaching real climate policy or climate ambition almost anywhere in the world. Now we're 2 years later, and the story of climate change is much more on the front pages of our newspapers, in our nightly television news, and in our minds as citizens. And as a result, we're starting to see much more ambitious, at least pledges towards climate action among many of the world's leading economies, but also many developing economies as well. And I think that that's very encouraging. It's still not happening fast enough. but it's very encouraging. And I think it has to do with people for the first time really taking in the full scale and speed and severity of the crisis, as I did a few years ago.
Yeah, I think what you highlight in the first part of your answer on how you're being a journalist. It's not advocating for an agenda, but really just telling the truth in an effective way. I think that really that's the critical part here, because I think to some extent that sense of sometimes when you hear stories about the climate crisis and you hear it from advocates, some people who are skeptics, who are skeptics before they listen to the story will remain skeptic because of who's telling the story. But I think more and more journalists are taking this responsibility and leadership of telling the story better to the world as I guess the champions of truth, right? And with journalists there comes a sense of credibility, and you actually use science in the story. So, and I think more and more we see that around the globe, that journalists are doing that work. But unfortunately, I think if I can just bring you down a little bit to what's going on in Indonesia, we have not yet have our. I actually come across your book because of AOC's post. So Ocasio-Cortez posted on her Instagram that she's reading your book, and that's how I come across it, and I read it as well. But I think in terms of thinking about political figures in Indonesia, where the climate crisis is the very issue that they're championing, we're not there yet. Actually, there's a global survey which shows that around 6% of Indonesians deny climate crisis, and 18% believe there's climate crisis, but that humans have nothing to do with it, or something like that. I might miss a little bit of what that survey is telling, but basically, I think when I talk to grassroots, it's not on top of their mind, not in the way that I think globally in the Western media, it's a lot more getting more spotlight. So what do you have to say to Indonesian journalists, perhaps, in how they can help cover the story even more effectively? I think there's a lot of very critical journalism work that has been out there on Indonesian story, looking at palm oil industry and so on. But I don't know, somehow it just hasn't come across to the political process. So I don't know if you have any insights or wisdom to share to the fellow journalists here, for example.
Well, I think the main thing is just to follow the story of the world as it unfolds. And, it's interesting when we're talking about journalists coming forward and telling the story a little more forthrightly. I think they really are aided in the way that the planet is already changing in quite visible ways. For a long time, a generation, anyone who was writing about the climate crisis was really writing about the future. And of course, that is an important part of the story, because wherever things are now, inevitably they will be getting at least somewhat worse, and perhaps quite dramatically worse, depending on the choices we make going forward. But I think over the last few years especially, the changes are unmistakable in the present tense. And I think people, even who are not consuming the news of science journalism or climate journalism, see the effects through floods, through more intense cyclones, through heat waves, and all the other effects that we know are the product of climate change. So my own sort of advice is just to tell those stories as directly and forthrightly as we possibly can whenever we're talking. Not necessarily to feel obligated to make a huge splash of a big climate story, but simply to be mindful whenever you're talking about any of these effects, to remind readers or listeners or viewers that climate is a part of those changes, so that we have a clearer sense that everything that is changing about our environment is the result of these forces. And if we want to stabilize the system and secure something like the world that we know today, it will require quite dramatic action to make sure that those forces are kept in check. But I have to say, the poll numbers that you cite strike me as quite optimistic. I mean, if 6% of the country doesn't believe in climate change and 18% doesn't believe that it's human caused, that's a total of 24%, which is roughly in line with the level in the U.S. About 70 to 80% of Americans believe that climate change is real and human caused. And I wish that those numbers were all the way up to 100, both in America and in Indonesia. But we don't tend to wait for populations to have total unanimity on a subject before governments take action. In the US, I often say, 25% of Americans don't believe in climate change, but 25% of Americans also believe that aliens live on planet Earth with us. And we're not giving our NASA policy over to those people. So we don't need to give our climate policy over to climate deniers either. Unfortunately, we have. And that's not just the case in the US, it's the case all around the world, because the fossil fuel industry has played a really outsized role in politics in nearly every country. In fact, we often talk about the fossil fuel industry as though it's, this an embodiment of corporate villainy. But the large majority of the world's fossil fuel companies are state controlled. So and that dynamic is, I think, really interesting and important to think through. There was a recent paper that I've been thinking a lot about. It just came out a few weeks ago, that addressed itself to the question of inaction in the face of climate change. For a long time, economists suggested that nations and the global community as a whole found a hard time responding to the crisis, even as scientists warned about it, because there was this, what they called a collective action problem, where any individual nation didn't want to move first and move most aggressively if the rest of the world wasn't also moving on climate change. And that was because it was thought that the costs of action would be borne by the nation and the benefits distributed globally. So the incentives there were not so aligned. And that this free rider problem had, it was long theorized by economists, had really stymied climate action. But a new comprehensive paper looking at the last few decades of climate policy at the state level and the international level found that, in fact, that had not affected global decision-making or national decision-making significantly at all. And in fact, the much larger problem was simply the contest between those who benefited from the status quo and those who would benefit from policy changes. And I'm not someone who tends to blame the fossil fuel business per se. I'm not, in the world of people who are interested in and focused on and advocating for addressing climate change, I tend to take a broader view and not villainize or vilify those companies especially. But it does seem that the power of the fossil fuel business and their supporters has been at least a major, if not the major obstacle to change going forward. And that's another reason I personally have some amount of hope, because I think that the cultural forces there are changing in the same way that, they turned against, say, the tobacco industry in the US a generation ago. We're seeing the fossil fuel industry viewed in a different way and with much less sympathy, not just by consumers, but also by investors. And I think those forces are helping us move in the right direction. Again, as with every other part of the story, we're not moving fast enough, but the changes are there. And if we had an infinite amount of time, I'd actually be quite encouraged by how much progress is being made. Unfortunately, time is relatively tight, and the changes, as you know well in Indonesia, are already upon us.
Yeah, and when we were talking about that, forces on the other side, it always reminds me of the book, actually the documentary, which I watched, The Merchants of Doubt. So in terms of storytelling, it's both sides, right? Like, we need to be telling the story of the truth, the scientific truth of the climate crisis, but at the same time, we're doing that in a very tight timeline, as you said, and in opposition of the force from the other side. So that's what makes this quite challenging, I think. And at the end of the day, it's about climate action. And when you're thinking about getting investment where they should be, getting policy reforms that we need, we can't forget the fact that we're in the middle of pandemic, of course. So I'm going to touch on that a little bit. Just the fact that in terms of prioritizing policy, right? I think the pandemic kind of brings another layer of challenge to climate action in a way that, or at least that's how it has been Indonesia's case, where I see that some countries are seeing the pandemic as a momentum to invest in green projects, create green jobs as part of the economic recovery, but many others, prioritize the short-term recovery needs, and put the sustainability element second, let's say. So if how would you? I guess if I can put the question a little bit more creatively, if you're writing the book or if you're publishing the book after the pandemic, with the pandemic in mind, how would you have told the story differently? How should we be linking the pandemic to climate crisis?
Well, I think I'd say a few things. The first is that a lot of the lessons of the pandemic are also the lessons of the climate crisis. The pandemic tells us that our life is much more fragile than we might have assumed, that there are forces emerging from the natural world and our destruction of the natural world that are much more powerful than we might have thought. And there is, in the sense that there is a sort of direct climate connection, in the sense that climate change will be producing likely more pandemics like this as more ecosystems are disrupted by the forces of development. It also shows us that the world can change quite quickly in response to a threat. In that sense, I think that there is a kind of encouraging lesson, especially from the first few months of the outbreak, and maybe even especially in the countries of East and Southeast Asia, which have done so well to respond to the threat of the disease, much less well in Europe and North America. But even in those places, even in Europe and North America, over the course of the spring, many of these countries, in the space of a few weeks, went from not even having heard of this disease to completely shutting down in order to protect their citizens. And that is an unbelievably dramatic action that at least I would have thought was sort of unimaginable a year or so ago. And it gives me hope that some of these systems that we assume are sort of permanent, or at least incredibly difficult to uproot, are in fact changeable on relatively fast timelines, which is encouraging when it comes to climate. The other thing that's been, I would say, sort of halfway encouraging is that in the stimulus packages that the world's governments have prepared to sort of supplement or stabilize the well-being of their citizens through this crisis, you've seen a willingness to spend much more money than just about any of these governments had felt comfortable doing over the previous generation. And that, I hope, will lead to a sort of paradigm shift in which governments are comfortable taking much more direct action and helping redesign the lives of their citizens. I worry that we'll pass through the other side of the pandemic and we'll feel exhausted financially and culturally, and not want to take on another a challenge as large as the climate crisis. But I think there's the possibility that we've entered into a new era in which we're, say, much more comfortable with large-scale, central bank stimulus and fiscal spending from centralized governments. We don't yet know. What we do know is that there will be at least a year from now in which governments are likely continuing to spend at this rate in order to help buoy their economies. And I think that is the central challenge of the very present tense when it comes to climate, is to make sure that that stimulus spending is as helpful to a climate recovery and a global decarbonization program as is possible. Now, when we look back on the past year, I think the results and the returns are sort of discouraging. There have been parts of the world that have focused a significant, if not overwhelming amount of their stimulus spending on sort of green targets. Europe in particular, depending on how you tabulate it, has spent between a quarter and 40% of its stimulus on decarbonization related projects, which is quite a lot and probably will do a lot to help the recovery there be green, and in fact bring about a greener future for that continent. But most of the rest of the world has spent just a fraction of their stimulus spending on green projects. In the US, I think it's in the order of 1 or 2%, same with China. And of course, those are the two major drivers of the story as we go forward. So my hope is, especially in the US under a new presidential administration, that spending will be more focused on green initiatives. And especially given the new commitments that Xi Jinping has made in China just over the last few months, that spending there will similarly follow that trajectory. But I worry that it won't be sufficient, and in fact, that we'll end up on the other side of this crisis, unwilling to engage in that kind of spending again for a generation, which would be completely catastrophic for climate change. We have the opportunity now that the spending is ongoing and the willingness is there. We just need to redirect it towards the future that we know we want, rather than the one that we should be running in fear from.
Yeah, exactly. So I think also to bring this as to the individual level, right? As a reader, I think people associate the year 2020 at the end with anxiety. That's it. I think that's the theme of the year. It's anxiety about the pandemic, the uncertainties around it, and the climate crisis is kind of this big thing that's also that people are anticipating behind them. It's like even when the pandemic is over, there's still climate crisis we need to deal with. And reading your book, again, I think even before reading your book, I'm already anxious about about climate change. Right? I've been reading a lot of books. I'm an environmental economist, so I work a lot with doing analytics around policy reforms that's needed to push for climate action and so on. So I'm aware of the trajectories of the scenarios, right? And reading your book kind of adds even more anxiety because it's just so vivid, and it's such well illustrated scenarios that I can see what it will look like, including you touch on the possible scenario of kind of 20% of global GDP retracting as a result of the climate crisis, and permanently. Right now, people are anxious looking at the economic recession, and we're still on an optimistic scenario that after the pandemic it will go back, but it's not with the climate crisis, right? So when you write the book, do you think about what kind of effect it would have on the reader, and do you realize that you're making people anxious, and is that the kind of intention? I mean, of course it's not the intention, but like, why do you choose this way of telling the story, knowing well that maybe it will make people anxious?
Well, I think the short answer is, my first answer is really that I'm just trying to depict the story as I see it unfolding and not aiming for a particular result. But to the extent that it produces anxiety in the reader, I would say that that's valuable in the sense that the overwhelming problem with our response to climate change has been our complacency. And I think that the most important thing to do is to shake that complacency. Now, we were talking earlier about the levels of public awareness and concern in Indonesia and around the world about climate change. And honestly, that to me, those polls, as I said a few minutes ago, are quite high in the sense that there are a lot of people just about everywhere who are now aware and concerned about climate change. But what strikes me is that they're not nearly as concerned as they should be. And we have a kind of a tendency, I see it particularly vividly in the US political context, where we think, okay, now we get Donald Trump out of office, we get Joe Biden in office, we've replaced a kind of climate skeptic with someone who understands the crisis. Now that'll all take care of itself. And no, in fact, it requires much more large-scale change than almost anyone appreciates. And as a result, I think we can't just assume that it's a matter of believing in the science or believing that climate change is real. We have to understand just how aggressively, urgently, dramatically, and comprehensively we have to change our energy systems and, frankly, much of the way that we live our lives to produce a stable climate going forward. I think that the first step of that sort of awakening is to understand that we cannot be complacent. We don't have enough time. We don't have the time to waste. And we need to understand just how dramatic the consequences are so that we understand just how dramatically we need to act. And I say this as someone who went through this awakening myself. I think it's a quite powerful psychological and cultural pattern that when we look out our window every day, we see the world as it is. And so our expectations for the future are anchored by our understanding of the present tense. And it's actually hard for us to imagine the world changing all that much, because even as much as we try to imagine a future, either an optimistic future or whatever kind of future, we have so much more experience of the present tense world than we could ever experience any future world. And that means that we just intuitively believe that the future is going to be quite like the world as it is today. And the climate science says that just isn't the case. And anything we can do to sort of reorient our expectations away from stability and the world continuing to resemble itself as it goes forward, and more reorients us more towards a world that is quite dramatically changed and which requires a level of real adaptation from us, I think the better off we'll be. I think anxiety is, you know, a part of that story, a part of that transformation, and I think it's valuable to do so. The economic numbers, you know, themselves, I think, are quite striking and interesting. I should say that, you know, that figure that global GDP could shrink by 20 or 30% over the course of the century. First of all, it's predicated on a kind of a worst case emissions path that we're not likely to follow. And second of all, it's compared to the global economy as it would be without climate change, not as it is today. So we're not talking about absolute shrinkage, just shrinkage from where we might be. Nevertheless, especially in countries like Indonesia, we don't want to be cutting off the possibility of future economic growth, because so much human prosperity has been produced and human dignity has been produced in recent decades as Indonesians have attained global middle classness. We want to see those trajectories continue, and that means trying to engineer a world in which continued economic growth is as much economic growth as possible as we can. And that means, I think, securing a stable climate as quickly as we can, so that we can at least hope for the kinds of continued trajectories of human flourishing that we've seen over the last few decades.
Yeah, and in the case of Indonesia, it's interesting, right? When we're talking about that trajectory of, I think right now around 20% of Indonesians, or at least before the pandemic, are entering or are in the middle class, which has been a growth in the past few decades. I think much of that owes to extraction or utilization of natural resources. For the case of Indonesia, we rely a lot on our let's say agriculture industry, our commodity exports, and so on. And so I think often in Indonesia, when you talk about the climate crisis and the fact that Indonesia is one of the top emitters just by way of deforestation and peat fires and forest fires, I think people worry that would mean that we have to stop utilizing the natural resources that have fueled growth in the past 20 years. So I think going back to what you said about complacency and the issue of just people not wanting to change because they're afraid of what the change would how it would affect them. That's really the difficult part. How you get people to want to change and to take action. I think it's one thing for people to understand about the climate crisis and believe in it. And I agree with you. I think 75% is quite a high number. It's quite it's quite a good number and overall. But it's another thing to be talking about prioritization of issues. And one way to measure this is when you listen to political debates of presidential candidates or governor candidates and so on. You don't really hear the climate crisis as the phrase they throw around. If they ask that question, it would be on the fifth debate, on the last question. So it's one thing to be aware of it, but it's another to have the awakening, as you said. I really like that phrase, but it's another for the people to push the government to do more, and for the government to take the leadership to take action, right? And I think it comes down. My next question is around this idea of just noise, right? Like, how do you because information is everywhere, we scroll endlessly on a daily basis. We read news on a lot of issues. Everybody produces content. Everyone is making content on YouTube, on Instagram. Besides news, news as well as a critical source of information. But we know that people, the youth especially, take information from TikTok, a lot of other media. So how do you see this? How do you, especially as a journalist, right? how can we reach out to the critical mass in a way that's effective, knowing well that there are many channels of information that they access information from, and for the case of Indonesia, how can people not just be aware of the climate crisis, but that it should go upward in the list of prioritized issues politically?
Well, honestly, I don't think that there's any one way. I would not suggest that there's a single path, a single storytelling path, a single narrative path that all people trying to spread awareness should take. I think everyone should respond to their own responses to the climate crisis and, try to communicate in their own ways. In that way, I see, the social media is really valuable in that everybody has their own platform, and also in offline. People can talk about climate change with those around them. That's the beginning of a kind of a political revolution. In terms of how we can leverage that anxiety and conversation towards real political action, I think that a few lessons or a few pieces of advice I would give are, the first is that for a very long time, we've talked about the climate crisis in moralistic terms. When we talked about the economics of it, we emphasized the costs of decarbonization, not the benefits of it. And I think in part that was because the economics did suggest that it was going to be quite costly. But that conventional wisdom has really changed over the last few years. And now almost any economist you ask would tell you that the world's economy will be healthier in relatively short order if it is also greener. The IMF suggests that, globally we're subsidizing the fossil fuel business to the tune of $5.3 trillion a year. And that's a little bit misleading because it has to do with not adequately accounting for the environmental impacts of burning fossil fuels, not just direct subsidies. Nevertheless, it tells you just how much we are doing to sustain a business that is killing us, and how much better off we might be if we simply removed those subsidies. I think we need to talk more and more, not just about the benefits of a cleaner planet in sort of moral terms, but in economic terms as well. And I think the key there would be my second piece of advice, which is that we should talk much more about the public health impacts of these issues, especially of air pollution, which is from wildfires, forest fires, and the burning of fossil fuels, is so dramatic. The effects are everywhere you look on, cancer, on respiratory health, on asthma, on ADHD, and it affects premature birth and low birth weight. It affects cognitive performance. It affects rates of schizophrenia and autism. I mean, the number of aspects of well-being that are affected by air pollution is almost infinite. And the benefits of cutting out that air pollution are really quite dramatic. Now, I don't know the exact, I know that there have been some quite dramatic air pollution events in Indonesia, and there, some cities are dealing with sort of perpetual air pollution, but I don't know the granular details in the same way I do the US. And yet, I think talking about the US situation is illustrative, because generally speaking, globally, by global standards, the US has quite clean air. And yet, it's been estimated by people who study air pollution that the entire project of decarbonization in the US, getting the US from where we are today to a totally net zero, no net carbon production system, would be entirely paid for through the public health benefits of cutting air pollution. So we wouldn't need to worry about increased electricity efficiency. We wouldn't need to worry about the effect on sea level rise or agriculture, any of the other things that happen when we decarbonize. Simply through cutting air pollution, we would see the immediate economic benefits that would pay for the entire project itself. And I say that calculus is true in the US, where the air is already pretty clean and people are not suffering from air pollution in the same way that they are suffering from it in India, in China in particular, but also all throughout the developing world, which means that calculus is even more true for those countries, that the benefits would be so immediate, so dramatic, and so all-encompassing that even putting aside all of the other considerations, even putting aside entirely the moral case of trying to preserve a habitable planet for future generations, and just looking at the economic benefits of cutting air pollution, the argument there is quite clear. And I think climate advocates haven't been nearly as forceful in telling that story as they could be. And I think that that's a tragedy, in part because it is something that the average citizen feels very clearly. You know, clean air and clean water are concrete, you know, factors in the lives of individuals, and almost everyone would agree they would prefer to breathe cleaner air and drink cleaner water than the alternative. Now, if you also told them that polluted air and polluted water is not the cost of growth, which is what we were told for a generation, but in fact is impeding growth, and you will not just be healthier, but more prosperous if we lived in a cleaner, less polluted world, the logic of that argument is quite profound, clear, and persuasive. And I think we should be leaning on it more and more.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you said about, you know, how we should shift the story from a moral standpoint to a more economic story. But we also know, and you actually touched this on one of your chapters, on the irrationality of humans, right? Because even when you make a very, you know, the science is clear, the economic calculation is clear, but still, you know, first of all, it's a really polarized world today, you know, in the US especially, but it's also true in Indonesia to a large extent, even though change is not one of the things that we're most polarized about, but it's still a polarized, let's say, playing field. And people have biases, they have cognitive bias, you know, they filter information in a way that supports their priors, their beliefs. So, you know, and this is actually a question coming from the audience. Unfortunately, the person doesn't want to disclose his or her name, but when you write The Uninhabitable Earth and in your journalistic work, do you also think about the polarizedness of your audience, and how do you address this? Like, how do you, I guess, embrace people from both sides of the poles and you know, make the story work for both?
Well, you know, I think about it primarily in the American context. You know, when I didn't write this book thinking it would be an international story, it's turned out to be that, which I'm grateful for and happy to play a part of a kind of a unfolding global story. But I thought of my work primarily as being for an American audience, and in that context, you know, I think that all of us on both sides of every aisle need to be more concerned about this challenge. And I think that we see in the US especially polarization declining around climate change. That is, when you look at, you know, the Republican Party in the US, younger Republicans are quite concerned about climate change and want to do something about it quite urgently. You know, generationally, older Republicans are much less engaged, but the story that tells is that the country is coming around to climate action generally. I think that's true really around the world, where, again, as I was saying earlier, when we were talking about this story in the future tense and projecting possible scenarios, it was a lot easier for the average citizen to treat those projections as merely projections around which you could assemble all of your biases and political preferences. But when we're seeing the crisis now in real time, in our own lives, it becomes a lot harder. And you see that all around the world, where even communities that are, you know, not supportive of climate action are nevertheless taking kind of extreme measures to protect themselves from the changing climate, from rising seas, from, you know, more intense hurricane seasons, et cetera. But, you know, in general, I think that climate action can be undertaken by anyone, no matter their political preferences. And I look at, for instance, you know, the leadership in China, which is, you know, I have many problems with Xi Jinping's regime, with what they've done in Xinjiang and what they've done in Hong Kong, among many other issues. This is not what I would think of as a sort of laudable progressive regime by any standard. And yet you see quite dramatic commitments being made towards climate action. Now, they're still just pledges. We don't know how far they'll go fulfilling them. And they're simultaneously doing a lot of things with coal plants that are quite damaging to the planet. So I don't want to overly praise them. But you see there the possibility of a quite authoritarian and self-interested regime, nevertheless moving at the rhetorical level much more quickly on climate than one might have expected a decade or 2 decades ago. And I think that path is available everywhere in the world. Now, in the US, I often hear from people who will point to that model and say, well, maybe democracy is a challenge to climate change, and maybe what we need is the kind of executive leadership exhibited by Xi Jinping to tackle the crisis, to which I'd say, we'll see. But to this point, it's been the liberal democracies of the world who have moved fastest on climate. It happens that there are also many of the world's richest countries, which I think is driving the change more than the political structure. Nevertheless, it's not the authoritarian countries of the world that are moving fastest. And there are also people in the US who say, well, what we need is a real, an overthrow of capitalism and a sort of the rise of an eco-socialist agenda, and that we won't be able to solve the crisis without that. And to them, I say, well, socialist countries of the world actually haven't exhibited all that much leadership on climate either. And while I do think that the state of, fossil capitalism as we know it needs to be reformed dramatically, personally, I don't think that it requires a total overthrow of the system either, and that we can achieve the kinds of changes that we need through and in something like the systems that we have today. In fact, if we have a hope of preserving the climate system as we know it, we need to use those. We need to use the existing political structures, because we don't have the time to both have revolutions and address the climate crisis. The timelines are just too short for that. But I think that in general, the biggest teaching tool for anyone anywhere on the political spectrum and anywhere on the spectrum of climate denial is the news from climate. And that if you have your eyes open and you see typhoons and you see flooding and you see intense rainfall and you see drought and you see famine, all of that is an unmistakable sign that this crisis is here and real. And if we want to preserve some amount of prosperity and human flourishing going forward, we need to address it, whatever our political disposition is.
Yeah, I'm glad you took the conversation this direction, because, between my friends, we joke about maybe we need an executive leadership, as you said, to take action here to see actual change in Indonesia. But I think, as you highlighted, in the global scale, if we zoom out, we see that liberal democracies do take action and are where the fastest action happen. But I think it's not as simple as that, right? The political spectrum is a bit more complicated. And for Indonesia's case, for example, yes, we are a democracy, but very different in the way that, for example, the US bi-party system works. We have multi-parties here, and we don't have kind of majoritarian and therefore representation, and just the role of parties become really critical. And when you have too many parties and too many candidates, there are certain systems that you still need to navigate around to get a political reform across, I guess. And so the question here is, and this is a question, the question asked by the audience from Maharani and Rivan, in terms of seeing change, right? I think many people are sold on the climate crisis is real, it's urgent, and we need to take action. But this sense of, I guess, helplessness, the fact that it's a systemic, what we need is a systemic change, where the government leaders, the private sector leaders are the ones who can make change happen, sometimes make us feel like it's not clear what our role is and or how to push that massive change at the upstream, like at the at the higher level, take place. And that's why sometimes when people talk about climate change here, sometimes it feels an elitist issue, and politicians don't fight for this issue because it's not as grassrooted. Like not everyone talk about it. So on both the demand and supply side, it seems like the political setup is not doesn't work for this issue in particular. And some people might say that in a country like Indonesia, that's developing, we still have to think about other issues first. So how do you get people out of this helplessness feeling? Because I think even though they're sold on the fear part and on the anger part, on the urgency that something needs to happen, the hopefulness part, I think what you touched on the much needed optimism and the path forward is not as clear. So how have you tried to show that path through your work, I guess?
Well, honestly, for me, false optimism is a bigger threat than fatalism, in the sense that the one thing we really can't afford is to sit idly by and assume that things will work themselves out. The question is, as you say, how to produce an engaged response that really accelerates political change. And to me, the most inspiring example here is the global climate strikers. These are people almost, overwhelmingly teenagers. So they're not people with even a vote. In many parts of the world, those groups are led by people in marginalized communities. Many of them are queer. So they're, if you were to imagine, you and I may feel disempowered to address the climate crisis, but almost nobody is more disempowered than the people who have led these global climate strikes. And while you and I may look at the system as overwhelming and large and think, what could I possibly do, and feel a little defeated by that, these are kids who had the same set of, looked around, saw the same set of challenges, and in fact were even farther from the levers of political power, and didn't respond to that by giving up, but by saying that they were going to make a place for themselves at the table of political negotiation on climate. And then they did that. And they did that through activism and organizing and marching. And they've done that all around the world in countries both, quite liberal and progressive, and quite authoritarian, quite advanced, and quite, still developing. This is, to me, an incredibly inspiring story. The narrative about climate change has been completely rewritten over the last few years. There are a number of things going into that, including, as I was saying earlier, the accumulation of natural disasters that we're seeing. But a big part of it has been the global political awakening of climate youth. And I think that should be an inspiring and honestly shaming example for the rest of us, because these are people who have even less political power than, say, you and I might, and yet they've responded to that by asserting themselves quite directly. Now, it's not the most appealing answer because, it doesn't allow for the possibility that any individual can really make a difference on their own by making changes that are in their life that are within their control. But that is the state of the problem. It is a global problem. And we need large-scale national and international policy changes to really transform our energy systems to allow for a stable and prosperous future. Given that, the only path forward really is through politics. And so I think, people should do what they can in their own lives to make change, but the way to feel empowered is to engage in activism and politics, not to try to focus on the things that you can control, because honestly, the things that you can control are quite trivial to the overall problem, and we need a much larger response if we have a hope of securing this sort of green, livable future.
Yeah, definitely. So on that word, inspiring, I think we're running out of time, but hopefully the listeners or audience of this event are also as inspired as I am with your stories and insights. So we thank you very much for that. I think just to close the session, I want to ask a question from another audience here on whether you're writing a new book and what can we expect on that next book if you're writing any, and when we expect it.
Well, no, the short answer is no, I'm not. I mean, there are a few different things that I'm working on. I'm particularly interested in thinking a little more clearly about the adaptation side of the climate equation. If we take seriously the idea that something like 2 degrees Celsius is now unavoidable, what sorts of changes will be required to allow us to live in that world? It may be a bigger project even than the decarbonization project to adapt to those changes, and maybe as profound for our sense of self and purpose and the trajectory of our civilizations than the decarbonization story. So that's something I'm thinking about. And then there's some other projects that I'm working on that aren't so directly related to climate, but I'm not yet writing anything at book length. So at the moment, I'm just sort of curious to see how this story unfolds in the world. Particularly with the Joe Biden presidency in the U.S. And China's new climate commitments, I'm really curious to see how the world moves forward on the geopolitical stage in tackling climate. And I think if we look at just over the last year, we've seen quite dramatic net zero commitments from the EU, from Japan, from China, and to trust Joe Biden's platform, the US. Those countries together make up about 50 or 60% of global climate emissions. And so if those countries hold to those commitments, we could actually be in relatively good shape. I think the project now is seeing how much we do fulfill those promises and how much we backslide and how much room we give ourselves. And exactly how that negotiation is conducted at the geopolitical level is one that I'm very interested in. Thinking about how the climate crisis and the decarbonization project intersect with emerging stories of international politics, and particularly the growing rivalry, which perhaps even conflict between the world's two superpowers, the US and China.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up the story of adaptation. I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation. It's 8:30 p.m. here in Indonesia, and I think after this, hopefully how we adapt to climate crisis will be what we will be dreaming of tonight as we go to sleep. I think for Indonesia in particular, as an archipelagic country, we are, climate crisis will be affecting all countries equally, but especially for an archipelago like Indonesia, I think we're particularly vulnerable to climate crisis. And it's 8:30 a.m. there in New York, so we want to thank you, David, for making the time to talk to us. I think many audience have been looking forward to this session, and I hope it's somewhat useful for you as well.
Thank you so much, Afu. It's been great to talk to you, and hopefully I'll cross paths with you at some point in the future, and hopefully we'll make it to Jakarta before too long.
Yes, please. I think I'll ask the organizers to take you here next time. So thank you very much again, and thank you everyone for watching. Have a nice evening.
Litbite Lite, obrolan virtual yang ringan dan bergizi. Mari saling sapa, berbagi cerita, bertukar gagasan, dan mendiskusikan isu-isu terbaru dan industri kreatif lainnya.